Okay, this is the video that will help you with the assignment for Brazil's revolution. The name of the assignment is called Brazil's Unique Revolution. Unique because it stands alone, it's different, it's out of the ordinary. It was a revolution in which a monarchy or an empire, a monarchical empire, was replaced with another one. In other words, like with most revolutions, like what happened with the American Revolution, with our revolution, we, we broke away from England and we didn't have another king, right? George Washington didn't become king; he became the first president, and we now have a republic that has a presidency instead of a king. Most revolutions are like that. The Russian Revolution overthrew the Tsar, and who was the emperor of Russia, and they had a communist state after that. Also in the Spanish colonies of South America, as we learned in the previous lesson, with in the northern part of South America with Simón Bolívar, and in the southern part of South America with José de San Martín. All of those territories became independent countries that were republics with presidents. Haiti, we learned that in the Haitian Revolution, right? They broke away from the French monarchy, or wasn't that an emperor, I guess, Napoleon. They broke away from the Napoleon's empire, and they, formed a republic. This is not what happened in Brazil. Brazil broke away from Portugal, and it became the Portuguese Empire, and it became its own empire. All right, so let's first of all start with what Portugal is. I don't think a lot of you know. Really, a lot of adult Americans don't know much about Portugal or Portuguese. I have found as an adult that when most Americans think that in Brazil that they speak Spanish. Why? Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. If you look at the maps that I put in the materials folder, you will see that Brazil is actually the same size as the continental USA, means the 48 states below Canada, right? Brazil's the same size. It's a huge country. It's the biggest country in Latin America, both by size and by population. And a lot of Americans think they speak Spanish there. They don't. They speak Portuguese. Portuguese is the language of Portugal. It is very, very similar to Spanish. You can read it. If you can read Spanish, you can read Portuguese. So Brazil has a different history than the rest of Latin America. It was not a colony of Spain. It was a colony of Portugal. Portugal is a tiny, tiny, tiny little country right next door to Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. So let's start with what happened with the Brazilian Revolution. Okay, so I'm going to write down words. If I write the word here, that means the word is going to be one of the fill-in-the-blank words. On your assignment, the word choice list that I gave you, the words are listed alphabetically. They're not written in the right sequence. It's going to be really hard for you to do the activity because there are 40 words if you don't know the history. So not only am I going to teach you the history, I'm going to write down the words that are in the fill-in-the-blanks on the board. If I write it on the board, that means it's going to be a fill-in-the-blank word. You write it down in your notes so that you can do this activity. All right, so let's start with what I said before. Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. It used to be a colony of Portugal. Remember, Portugal, very small country right next door to Spain. Now, they don't speak Spanish in Brazil, as I just said. They speak Portuguese. If you can read Spanish, you can read Portuguese. Not easily, but you can read it. You can read it pretty well. I can, at least. Hard to understand them when they speak, though. Really, really hard. Now, Brazil is a huge country. As I just said before, in land size, it is about as large as the continental USA. All right, so in colonial Brazil, remember, colonial Brazil, that means colonial, they were a colony of Portugal. So you have this huge country that was controlled by this tiny little country across the ocean. All right. You can fit Portugal inside of Brazil like 90 times. Brazil is 92 times larger than Portugal. So this tiny country had Brazil, this giant Brazil, as its colony. And during the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s, the owners of the plantations, because in Brazil, they grew sugarcane, a lot of sugarcane to make sugar. They grew tobacco, and they grew coffee. The owners of the plantations and also of the gold mines, because in the interior of Brazil, they found gold, which was horrible for the natives, the Brazilian natives. There were many different tribes that lived in the interior of Brazil. And so when the Europeans started hunting for gold, life got a lot worse for them than it already was. So the owners of the plantations and the gold mines had to pay the King of Portugal what was called the royal fifth. The royal fifth. So the royal fifth, that meant 20% of all crops, sugar, tobacco, coffee, and minerals, such as gold, that their African slaves had worked to produce, had to go to the Portuguese crown. So remember, when you say it goes to the crown, it doesn't mean it goes to an actual crown that would go on someone's head. When I say it goes to the crown, it means it goes to the bank accounts, or the coffers is what they'd probably say back then, of the King of Portugal, the King and the Queen of Portugal. Okay, so it goes to the crown, it means it goes back to Portugal, where the king rules, or the queen rules. All right, now, the criollos, Now, before we learned the word criollos, which means Creoles in English, but not the exact same meaning. This is the Portuguese word, criollos. You should already know the Spanish word criollos because we learned about it with the revolutions in the Spanish colonies. So the criollos, who were the sons and daughters of the peninsulares, that means the people who came from the Iberian Peninsula, in Brazil's case, the Portuguese colonizers. They were full-blooded white European Portuguese people. They were the ones who had the power. The African slaves and the Brazilian natives did not have the power. The criollos did. So the criollos who lived in Brazil resented. They didn't like it. It made them angry towards Portugal. They resented having to pay the royal fifth. Remember, 20% of what they earned, and what the slaves made and the natives made. They thought that they could do really well on their own as an independent nation and didn't see why they had to keep paying the royal family over in Portugal the royal fifth. All right? So then something happened. Napoleon, the French military emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, we've spoken about him before. You should know him by now, at least have a rough idea of who he is. The French military emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded the Iberian Peninsula. Remember, a peninsula is land with water on three sides of it, like the state of Florida, that's a peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is shaped like a square, kind of, and it has the Kingdom of Spain, or it had the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of Portugal on it. So Napoleon came, he invaded Spain, he invaded Portugal. Now the Portuguese, they were allies with the British, and the British were enemies of Napoleon. So Napoleon was like, hey, Portuguese royal family, if you're allies or friends with the British, who's my great enemy, then I'm going to come after you guys. And the Portuguese army was not strong enough to fight Napoleon's forces, and they knew this, so the royal family fled. Remember, Fled is past tense of flee, to run away, to leave quickly. They fled to Brazil and lived in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Today, Rio de Janeiro is one of the most famous cities in the world, considered one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And they fled to this Brazilian city called Rio de Janeiro. Okay, so for 14 years, Brazil became the headquarters of the Portuguese Empire. I think it's the only example of a colony actually being the seat of government for the mother country. You know, we call the mother country the country that colonizes it. So England was our mother country. That's why we speak English in the USA, because English is the language of England, right? Portugal was their mother country. So Brazil was actually the headquarters or the seat of government. Now, Prince João, it's a really hard name to spell, João, not to spell, well, to spell and to say. João, I think it's pronounced João. So João is the Portuguese way of saying John. So when you hear João, it means John in English. So Prince João was the heir. Remember, the heir means he's going to get it, to the Portuguese throne. He's going to inherit it. He's going to inherit the throne. That means he will one day become king. He's first in line to the succession of the throne. So Prince João was going to become king. And his mother was the queen, and he was next in line. So he liked living in Brazil. He actually did a lot of great things for Brazil. He was very popular. So he got to Brazil, and he instituted a lot of reforms for Brazil. Let me see if I can. I've forgotten some of them, but they're here. Hold on. Give you some examples. Yeah, so this is according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. His ministry and the council, he had a Supreme Court, a royal treasury, royal mint, a printing office. He started the Bank of Brazil. He founded a royal library. He founded a military academy, medical and law schools. In 1815, he designated the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves Islands. So he made Brazil co-equal with Portugal. Instead of being just a colony, it was like a united kingdom. And the people in Brazil really, really liked this. So he liked what he was doing in Brazil. The Brazilian people liked what he was doing in Brazil. So, but history came in to mess with things a little. Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, this is something you need to learn, even though it's more about European history than Latin American history. The Battle of Waterloo. So, the Battle of Waterloo was the battle that defeated Napoleon. Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, and he lost power. And it's such a famous battle that when you say he met his Waterloo, like if you say that about someone, he met his Waterloo, that means he met his final defeat, his big defeat. So, and there's even like a song, an ABBA song called Waterloo, and it's very, very famous, the Battle of Waterloo. So Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and French troops withdrew from Portugal. French troops withdrew from Portugal. And then the next year, in 1816, Queen Maria, Prince João's mother, died. And upon the death of his mother, João became king of Portugal. But still, he did not want to return there. He wanted to stay in Brazil. He was like, oh, okay, I'm king, that's nice. I can just be king from here, from Brazil, you know? And the Portuguese were like, no, the royal palace is here, you know, you're the king of Portugal, and we're Portugal, come back, you know? But he stayed in Brazil. And then finally what happened was the Portuguese, I mean, they didn't have a king there, and there started to be radical revolts. Now remember, radical means you want a radical change of government. So this could have meant the threat of the monarchy being overthrown in Portugal and the royalty, the royal family losing control. And radical revolts broke out in Oporto, and most importantly in Lisbon. Lisbon is the capital of Portugal, beautiful city. I visited there, the capital. And so he was like, oh my God, there are radical revolts going on in the capital. So King João, remember, he was now king. King João decided to finally, he gave in and returned to Portugal. Now, I wasn't able to make the little tilde sign over the A. You're not going to see it written in the assignment, but that's how it's actually written. So King João. King João, remember that means King John. King João decided to return. So when King João went back to Portugal, he left his son, Prince Pedro. Pedro means Peter in English, Prince Peter. But in Portuguese and also in Spanish, Peter is Pedro. So he left his son, Prince Pedro, in power. He left him in charge, okay? But this was kind of like, in a way it was a mistake, because what ended up happening was, with his dad gone, Prince Pedro took over and he broke away from the monarchy of Portugal, and he began his own empire with him as the emperor. So at the time, there was growing antagonism. Remember, antagonism is like anger, resentment, animosity, bad feelings, beef between Brazilians and the Portuguese. So the Brazilian criollos, remember, the white Brazilians who had the power, said, we're different. Sure, we're ethnically, Portuguese, and we're racially European, but we feel culturally different. We are Brazilians. And they didn't want to keep paying the royal fifth, remember the 20%, and they formed a Brazilian political party, and they called for independence. They called for independence from Portugal. Now, this was great because they had an ally in Prince Pedro. Prince Pedro was very much a reformer, just like his father was a reformer and made a lot of reforms. He kind of felt the same way, and he also thought that Brazil should be an independent country. So he favored independence, but Portuguese loyalists, so what's a loyalist here? So these are the criollos who felt more Portuguese than Brazilian. They felt more tied to Portugal. So they were loyal to the Portuguese crown, to the Portuguese king, and to the Portuguese monarchy. The Portuguese loyalists in the Brazilian parliament wanted Brazil to remain a colony. They wanted Brazil to remain a colony. They didn't want it to become an independent country. So they wanted Brazil to remain a colony of Portugal. They demanded that Prince Pedro leave Brazil and go back to Portugal. And Pedro refused, and he gave a famous speech called Fico, which in Portuguese means I stay, or I am staying. And I'm not leaving, I'm staying. That was his speech. And on September 7th, 1822, he announced the independence of Brazil, and he was crowned emperor. Now, remember, an emperor is different than a king. An emperor is even bigger than a king. An emperor can control many kings. So even though England and Portugal and Spain were empires, they were entitled, their title was king, but they really were emperors. An emperor is a king that controls other countries. So he was crowned himself emperor instead of king. And he was only 23 years old. So think about all the stuff he'd already done in his life, and he was only 23. Imagine being an emperor at the age of 23. Okay, so, but Brazil was now an independent empire. It was not a republic. It was not a republic. So, as I said at the beginning, this is what makes it special. They did not break away from Portugal and form a republic. They broke away from the Portuguese Empire to become their own empire. So they didn't go from having a king to having a president. They went from having a king to having an emperor. So now his name is Emperor Pedro. So Emperor Pedro ruled Brazil for only 9 years. During his reign, Brazil fought a costly war with Argentina from 1825 to 1828. It was a 3-year-long war. During that war, a southern Brazilian province broke away and declared independence, a province. So a southern Brazilian province, a Spanish-speaking province broke away and became the Republic of Uruguay, or in Spanish, Uruguay. So I've been to Uruguay. It's got Brazil to the north and Argentina to the west of it. And it's a small country and they speak Spanish there. And they have their own kind of George Washington, his name was Artigas. And they have their own national identity. So they broke away from Brazil. And this was a problem that Pedro was having because all of these provinces were wanting to break away and form their own republics. Because again, Brazil is huge. It's the size of all the rest of Latin America and South America combined. You can have many countries inside of Brazil. So it's actually quite amazing that this incredibly huge territory remained one country and didn't break into like 10 different countries. So anyway, all of this happening, the war with Argentina, Uruguay breaking away, he didn't have the same talents as his father had. He was a little more kind of dictatorial in a way. So this made Pedro unpopular. Another thing about him, and this is a good thing about him, he wanted to abolish slavery. So he wanted to abolish, remember, abolish means to get rid of forever. He wanted to abolish slavery. And he's quoted as saying, why is his blood, his royal blood, better than anyone else's? And then he said, my blood is the same color as an African's blood. That's a quote of his. So he was for abolishing slavery, and this really angered the wealthy landowners. Wealthy landowners, that means rich. Rich landowners, people who owned plantations, and members of the Brazilian legislature. Now, why would this anger them, that the emperor wanted to outlaw slavery? Well, slavery was what made the Brazilian empire or the Brazilian country rich. It's what gave it all of its money. The sugar cane, the tobacco, the coffee, the gold mines, all the different minings they were doing for other minerals. Almost all of this work was being done by slaves, and slaves meant money, and they did not want slavery to be abolished. So as I told you before, the only revolution in the Americas that abolished slavery was the Haitian Revolution, the one in Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. That was a slave revolt by Black people of African descent who were like literally from Africa, born there, most of them. And the first thing they did when they drove away the French was they abolished slavery. It's the only country in the world, in the Americas, where slavery was abolished as a result. In the USA, we got our independence from England, and we did not abolish slavery until 1865. So like 87 years or something. Same thing with Latin America. Slavery was not abolished in Brazil until 1888 or 1889. So even, almost 20, 65, 75, 85, 13 years, 14 years after the USA outlawed slavery. It took another 14 years for Brazil to outlaw slavery. All right. So in 1834, Emperor Pedro abdicated. So remember, when you abdicate the throne, he abdicated the Brazilian throne. When you abdicate the throne, you give it up. You're no longer emperor or king or whatever. And he returned to Portugal. Now, He left behind his 5-year-old son. So imagine that. He abandoned his son. I mean, his son was well taken care of. He had a royal court and everything. But he left his 5-year-old son behind. And his 5-year-old son became Emperor Pedro II. So the next word is a title, a name. Emperor Pedro II. So, but he was only 5 years old, so they had to have a regency. What's a regency? A regency is a group of people who rule in the name of a child who is the king or the queen or the emperor or the empress. The child is too young to do the job himself, and they rule in his name until the child becomes an adult. And then when the child becomes an adult, the regency is over and he rules the country on his own. So Pedro II, even though for a good 12 years or something, he had a regency and he wasn't ruling anything, in title, he was the Emperor of Brazil for 58 years. His only heir, remember, the heir is the person who gets the throne, gets the crown, becomes king or queen afterward. His only heir was his daughter, Princess Isabel. And there's a lot of sexism back then, and he didn't think that a woman should rule Brazil, and he didn't have a son to leave the throne to. And then the ruling classes, remember, the rich criollos, or in Portuguese, criollos, the ruling classes, the people that had power, they didn't think a woman should rule Brazil either. So in 1889, there was a military coup d'etat. Remember, a coup is a military overthrow of the government by force. There was a coup d'etat, but the thing is, Pedro didn't really fight the coup. He was kind of ready for the monarchy to end anyway. It wasn't really his idea. He was born into this idea, and with the years, he was like, you know what? It's perfectly fine. Let's let this whole royal system end. Let this coup d'etat have success. I don't want my daughter to become empress. Let it happen. So there was really no fight about it. He abdicated the Brazilian throne. And then he went into exile. So exile is when you leave a country for political reasons. You don't leave because you're poor and you're looking for work. You leave for political reasons. And his political reason was he was no longer the emperor, and maybe he'd be in danger there, who knows. So he went back to Europe, or he went to Europe, and Brazil became a republic that year in 1889. And the first president of Brazil, because remember, when you have a republic, you don't have a king, you have a president. The first president was Manuel da Fonseca. Manuel da Fonseca. So Manuel da Fonseca was the first president of Brazil. Now, as I said, the independence of Brazil is different from that of other Latin American countries. Different from other Latin American countries, because it did not break away from an empire and soon after become a republic. As I said, rather it broke away from an empire and became an empire in itself. It did not become a republic until 67 years. 67 years after independence. Now in Mexico, they broke away from Spain and they had a little empire that lasted maybe 2 or 3 years. It didn't last 67 years. And in all the other countries, you instantly went to a republic. So this is how Brazil is special. It's a very strange revolution. It wasn't as bloody as other revolutions were. Some people call it the bloodless revolution. All right, so that is the assignment. All of the words that I've given you are words that are going to be in the fill in the blanks. So I hope you took notes. And if you need any help doing this assignment, let me know, okay? We can Zoom, we can do a Zoom meeting, or I can help you with the assignment over the phone over Google Voice, okay? All right, good luck.